I was born, owned, not in metaphor, not in poetry, in law, in practice, in flesh. Before I learned to walk, my body belonged to someone else. Before I learned my name, it could be taken from me. Before I learned to speak, silence had already been taught to me as survival. I did not grow up dreaming of freedom. I grew up learning how to endure the absence of it. And yet, one day, I would stand before men who believed power lived only in their hands, and I would speak, not softly, not carefully, but with a truth heavy enough to shake the ground beneath their certainty. Before I tell you how that happened, tell me something quietly. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Slow your breath. Let the noise fall away. This is my story, and I will walk it with you. I was born into time that did not belong to me. I do not remember the moment I was born, but I remember the shape of the world that waited for me. It was a world that moved slowly, not because it was peaceful, but because nothing in it was allowed to change. The days repeated themselves with such precision that time felt circular, like a wheel turning in place. I was born into that wheel. The room where my life began was not a place of celebration. It was a place of function. Wooden walls darkened by years of smoke and breath. A floor that had absorbed footsteps, spills, and quiet suffering. Light entered reluctantly, slipping through narrow openings, as if even the sun hesitated to witness what lived there. My mother held me without ceremony. Her arms were strong, not from choice, but from necessity. Strength had been forced into her bones through years of lifting, carrying, enduring. When she touched me, there was warmth, but also restraint. Love, where I was born, learned early how not to draw attention. They called me Isabella. The name rested on me like clothing that did not quite fit. It was not chosen to reflect who I was. It was chosen so that I could be identified, catalogued, claimed. A sound used to summon me, correct me, command me. Around me, people spoke Dutch. I learned the language, not as communication, but as survival. Words were not exchanged, they were delivered. Each command carried expectation. Each expectation carried consequence. I learned very early that hesitation was dangerous, so I learned to move quickly, to respond immediately, to read faces instead of sentences. I watched mouths more than I listened to words. A tightening jaw, a raised brow, a pause held too long. These were warnings more reliable than language itself. There was no space for innocence. Childhood was not a protected state, it was simply the period before usefulness could be extracted. As my body grew, attention followed. Eyes measured me, not for who I was becoming, but for what I would soon be able to do. I learned to carry weight before I understood why weight mattered. I learned to stand still for long periods of time, not because stillness was peaceful, but because movement invited scrutiny. Stillness was camouflage. Stillness could make you invisible for a moment longer. At night, the world changed its texture. The house quieted, but it never rested. Wood creaked. Breath travelled through thin walls. Somewhere nearby, someone always remained awake, not because they wished to, but because fear rarely sleeps when it has learned your name. I listened. I listened to whispered conversations that dissolved when footsteps approached. I listened to prayers, spoken so softly they felt more like thoughts than words. I listened to my mother speak to God, as if he were not distant, but careful, as if even he needed discretion. She never prayed loudly. Where I was born, hope learned how to fold itself small. I did not yet know the word freedom. No one taught it to me. It was not part of the language I was given, but I understood its absence with complete clarity. I understood that my body was not mine, that my time was not mine, that tomorrow did not belong to me in the way it belonged to others. Days passed in repetition. Morning, labor, correction, silence, night, and then again. Seasons changed outside, but inside my life, time remained fixed, heavy, unmoving, unresponsive. I did not grow through dreams. I grew through endurance. And deep within me, long before I had language for it, something began to take shape. Not rebellion, not anger, awareness. A quiet understanding that this world, solid and permanent as it seemed, was built by hands, enforced by habits, and therefore not eternal. I did not know yet that I would speak one day. I did not know yet that my voice would travel farther than my body ever could. But even then, even there, I was listening. The first time I was sold, no one explained it to me. There was no moment where someone knelt down and told me I was going somewhere else. No warning, no preparation, just movement, sudden, final, irreversible. One day, the world I knew existed. The next day, it did not. Hands that had always been there let go of me, as if they had been holding an object, not a child. Voices that shaped the rhythm of my days faded into distance. I remember turning my head, again and again, waiting for something familiar to reappear. It did not. I was carried across space, as if space itself had authority over me, lifted, passed, positioned. My feet touched new ground, and with that single contact, my old life ended. I learned something important that day. Leaving was not something I did. Leaving was something done to me. The man who bought me did not look at my face for long. His eyes moved over my body the way one examines tools, not with curiosity, but with calculation. How much weight could I carry? How quickly could I learn? How much correction would I require? I stood still. I did not cry. Crying never changed outcomes where I came from. Crying only announced weakness. That was another lesson. Silence travels better than tears. In this new place, everything felt sharper. The rules were unfamiliar. The tone of voices carried different dangers. I learned quickly that survival depended on speed, not of the body, but of understanding. Mistakes here were punished swiftly, not because they mattered, but because punishment maintained order. I learned to memorize patterns, morning sounds, footsteps, the way a door closed when someone was satisfied versus when they were not. I learned to anticipate anger before it arrived. Anticipation kept me alive. Time passed in fragments, not in memories, not in stories, just fragments of labor stitched together by exhaustion. Then I was sold again and again. Each sale removed another layer of continuity. Each new household erased habits I had just begun to master and replaced them with new ones that had to be learned immediately. There was no grace period. Ignorance was never an excuse. With every move, I understood less of who I was allowed to be. So I learned to become nothing in particular. I learned to disappear into function. When I was useful, I was tolerated. When I hesitated, I was corrected. When I failed, I was punished. Punishment did not arrive with explanation. It arrived with certainty. A hand, a voice, an object close enough to reach. Pain was not loud. It was repetitive. And repetition teaches obedience more effectively than fear ever could. My body adapted. It learned how to endure strain without complaint, how to move even when tired, how to keep working when the mind begged for rest. But my mind did something different. It learned how to step back. When pain arrived, I learned to observe it rather than fight it. I watched it move through me, register itself, and then fade just enough to make room for the next task. This distance saved me. Memory, however, became dangerous. Remembering faces hurt. Remembering voices created longing, and longing was a liability. So I taught myself not to linger, not to attach, not to expect permanence from anything that could be taken without warning. Still, some nights, when the house finally went quiet, memory returned without invitation. I remembered my mother's hands, the sound of prayer spoken under breath, the feeling of being held without purpose. These memories did not comfort me. They sharpened the absence. I learned then that loss does not always scream. Sometimes it settles into the body and stays there, heavy and unmoving. Years passed like this. I grew taller, stronger, quieter. People spoke around me as if I were not there, discussing my value, my usefulness, my future, all without ever asking what I wanted. It did not occur to them that I might want anything at all. And yet, something inside me continued to watch, not judge, not rebel, watch. I noticed patterns. I noticed contradictions. I noticed how those who claimed ownership over my body lived in constant fear of losing control. How authority required constant reinforcement. How violence was used, not because it was strong, but because it was fragile. This understanding did not free me, but it changed the shape of my silence. I was no longer empty inside it. I was listening. For a long time, language did not belong to me. Words existed around me, the way weather exists, unavoidable, powerful, indifferent to my understanding. They fell on me, whether I was ready or not. Commands, corrections, judgments spoken as facts. When I was small, Dutch filled the air. It was the language of the people who owned us, and therefore the language of authority. It arrived sharp and final, without room for interpretation. I did not learn it because I was taught. I learned it because not understanding it hurt. Pain is an excellent teacher. Every word carried weight. Every syllable held consequence. A misunderstood instruction could mean hours of punishment. A delayed response could mean humiliation delivered in front of others, a lesson not just for me, but for anyone watching. So I listened. I listened the way animals listen when danger moves nearby. Not casually, not passively, with my entire body. I learned to hear anger before it was spoken. I learned to recognize disappointment in silence. I learned that the absence of words could be more dangerous than shouting. English came later. It did not arrive gently. It arrived as replacement. One set of rules layered over another. One authority stacked on top of the previous one, each insisting it was absolute. English was confusing at first. It bent differently in the mouth. It carried its power less openly, hiding commands inside politeness, hiding cruelty inside structure. I did not trust it, but I learned it anyway. I learned English the way I learned everything else, through exposure, repetition, and fear of getting it wrong. I memorized phrases without understanding them fully. I repeated sounds that did not yet belong to me. Slowly, painfully, language began to settle inside my mind. With language came something new, awareness. I began to understand not just what was being said to me, but what was being said about me. I heard my body described in numbers, my labor measured in hours, my worth calculated in terms that had nothing to do with who I was. I heard men speak of ownership as if it were natural, as if domination was simply another law of nature, like gravity or weather. They spoke confidently, too confidently. Language revealed more than it concealed. I noticed how often they had to repeat themselves, how often rules had to be reinforced, how much energy it took to maintain control over other human beings. Authority, I realized, was loud because it was afraid of silence. And silence, my silence, was beginning to change. Before, my silence had been empty, a hollow space carved out by fear. Now, it was filling with understanding, with memory, with quiet judgment. I did not speak yet. Speaking was dangerous. Words, once released, could not be taken back, and I had learned the cost of misusing them. So I waited. I watched how language shaped reality, how it justified violence, how it erased humanity without ever naming what it was doing. I watched how religion was spoken of, how scripture was bent and folded until it fit neatly around cruelty, how God's name was used as permission rather than guidance. And yet at night, when no one was listening, I spoke to God differently. I spoke without grammar, without structure, without borrowed words. I spoke as myself, even before I fully knew who that self was. I did not ask for freedom. At first, I asked only for understanding. I asked why suffering seemed so carefully organized, why some people were taught to command and others to endure, why my body was strong enough to work endlessly, but never strong enough to be respected. I did not receive answers, but something else happened. I felt less alone. Language, I realized, did not only exist to control, it could also connect. It could shape thought. It could carry truth when the body could not. This understanding stayed with me. It grew quietly, the way roots grow underground, unseen, patient, unstoppable. During the day, I remained obedient. I worked. I endured. I responded when spoken to. I disappeared when necessary. But inside me, words were arranging themselves. Not sentences yet. Not speeches. Foundations. I was learning the language of those who owned me, and I was learning how fragile it was. They believed language belonged to them. They were wrong. There came a time when silence was no longer empty. It was no longer just the absence of speech or the careful withholding of words. It became something else, a space where thoughts gathered, where questions repeated themselves, where pain demanded explanation. That was when I began to speak to God. Not the God spoken of loudly in sermons, not the God used to justify ownership and punishment, not the God whose name was spoken confidently by men who never questioned their own authority. I spoke to God the way a drowning person speaks, not with elegance, not with certainty, but with need. I did not know how to pray properly. I had not been taught the right words, the right posture, the right order. Where I lived, prayer was something observed, monitored, corrected, but the prayers I carried inside me had no structure. They rose up at night, after labor had drained my body, after correction had bruised my skin, after language had failed me again. I would lie still, my eyes open in the dark, listening to the quiet movements of a house that never fully slept. Wood settling, breath passing through thin walls. Somewhere, always, the presence of someone who could wake and decide my fate without warning. That was when I spoke. I did not whisper. I did not speak aloud. I spoke inwardly, because inwardly was the only place that still belonged to me. I asked questions, not polite ones, not faithful ones. I asked why suffering was distributed so unevenly, why strength was demanded, but never honored, why obedience was praised, but humanity was denied. I asked why my body could endure endless labor, yet my spirit was expected to remain small and grateful. I asked why the same God was claimed by those who owned me and those who were owned. There were nights when anger filled my chest so completely that it frightened me. Not because anger was unfamiliar, but because it had nowhere to go. I learned then that anger, when trapped too long, turns inward. So I spoke to God before it could consume me. I told him I was tired. I told him I was confused. I told him that if this world was ordered by his will, then I did not understand him. I did not expect answers, but something happened anyway. Speaking, even without response, changed the shape of my endurance. It gave my suffering direction. It allowed me to locate myself within something larger than the walls that surrounded me. Faith, for me, did not arrive as comfort. It arrived as clarity. I began to feel that my life, though constrained, was not invisible, that my thoughts, though unspoken, were heard, that my existence extended beyond labor and punishment. This belief did not make my days easier. It made them bearable. During the day, I remained careful. I did not speak of what I carried inside me. Faith was dangerous when noticed. It could be twisted, tested, punished, but at night, I returned to it. Night after night, conversation after conversation, my prayers became less frantic, more focused, less about survival, more about meaning. I stopped asking why me. I began asking, what am I meant to see? And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my attention shifted. I began to notice how often fear ruled the lives of those who ruled me, how suspicion shaped their movements, how authority required constant vigilance, constant reinforcement, constant threat. They spoke of power, but they lived in fear of losing it. This realization did not embolden me outwardly. I did not suddenly defy orders or resist openly. But inwardly, something loosened. If power required so much effort to maintain, then perhaps it was not as absolute as it claimed to be. If authority relied on silence, then silence chosen rather than enforced could become something else entirely. My faith grew in this quiet space between obedience and awareness. I began to trust that my life had not been created solely for the purpose it was being used for, that endurance was not the final measure of my worth, that my voice, though unused, existed for a reason. I did not yet imagine myself speaking publicly. That possibility felt distant, almost impossible. but I began to imagine myself listening differently to the world, to others like me, to the quiet urgings within my own mind. Faith sharpened my perception. It taught me patience without resignation, endurance without surrender. And slowly, my silence began to feel crowded. It was no longer empty. It was full of words waiting for the right moment. I did not know when that moment would come. I did not know what form it would take. But I sensed that my life was moving, not forward in the way freedom moved, but inward, towards something solid and unshakable. I was still owned, still controlled, still expected to obey. But I was no longer alone inside myself, and that changed everything. There is a moment, quiet, unannounced, when obedience stops working. It does not arrive with rebellion. It does not announce itself as courage. It comes instead as exhaustion so deep that fear can no longer organize it. For me, that moment came slowly. Years of labor had taught my body how to move without instruction. My hands knew their tasks before commands were spoken. My back bent automatically. My feet carried me where they were expected to go. Obedience had become muscle memory, but memory has limits. There were days when my body responded correctly, yet something inside me lagged behind. A fraction of a second where my mind did not follow. A pause so small it was almost invisible, but it was there. That pause frightened me more than punishment ever had, because I could feel control slipping, not theirs over me, but mine over the system that had kept me alive. I had learned obedience as strategy, as camouflage, as survival. But survival began to feel like suffocation. Violence became more present during this time. Not sudden, it had always existed, but closer, less disguised, less justified. Correction turned into release. Punishment became routine. There were beatings that carried no lesson, only reminder. I learned then that violence was not always about discipline. Sometimes it was about reminding the world who could act without consequence. My body absorbed these moments the way it had learned to absorb everything else. Bruises faded, pain passed, work resumed, but something else accumulated. Resentment is too loud a word for what I felt. Hatred too sharp. What grew inside me was quieter and far more dangerous. Certainty. I became certain that obedience did not guarantee safety, that silence did not guarantee mercy, that doing everything correctly could still result in suffering arbitrary, unexplained, unavoidable. This certainty changed the mathematics of fear. If punishment could arrive, regardless of behavior, then behavior lost its bargaining power. That realization settled into me slowly, like a weight finding its place. I remember standing once in the field, my hands raw, my shoulders burning, the sun pressing down without apology. A command was shouted. I obeyed. Another followed. I obeyed again. And suddenly, without intention, without planning, a thought surfaced. This does not end. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever, if nothing changed. The thought did not panic me. It steadied me. Fear had always lived on the idea that compliance would eventually be rewarded, that endurance would lead somewhere, that patience had an end point. When that illusion dissolved, fear lost its leverage. I did not stop obeying, not yet. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still moved when told. I still lowered my eyes. I still measured my words carefully. But inwardly, obedience shifted from belief to performance. I was acting, and actors Even silent ones observe their audience. I watched those who punished me. I watched their moods, their inconsistencies, their moments of doubt. I noticed how cruelty intensified when they felt challenged, questioned, uncertain. Violence, I understood, was not confidence. It was compensation. This understanding did not free me, but it hardened something essential. Pain no longer taught me lessons. It confirmed conclusions. There were nights when my body shook from exhaustion and injury, when sleep came in fragments. During those nights, my prayers changed again. I stopped asking for endurance. I began asking for direction, not escape that still felt impossible, but clarity. I asked to be shown what mattered, what could not be taken, what could survive, even if my body did not. And slowly, my attention turned outward. I began to notice others like me, their expressions, their silences, their small acts of resistance, not defiance, but preservation. A refusal to forget a name, a memory passed quietly to a child, a story told in pieces, out of order, so it could not be fully erased. I realized then that obedience had not erased us. It had only hidden us. And hidden things, once noticed, are difficult to unsee. The world had taught me how to obey, but it had also, unintentionally, taught me how to endure without believing. And belief once removed leaves space. Space for choice. Space for movement. Space for a future not yet visible. I did not know how or when that space would be used, but I knew this. I could no longer confuse obedience with safety, or silence with peace. Something in me had crossed a line, not outwardly, not visibly, but permanently. And once crossed, there is no returning to the simplicity of fear. The night I chose to leave did not feel heroic. There was no sudden courage, no dramatic clarity, no certainty that I would survive what came next. What I felt instead was quiet, an unnatural quiet, as if something inside me had finally stopped arguing. I had learned to endure many things: hunger, pain, humiliation, exhaustion that settled into the bones and refused to leave. I had learned to accept that my body was not mine, that my time was not mine, that even my thoughts required caution. But that night, endurance failed me. Not loudly, not angrily. It simply stopped working. I remember lying awake, my body heavy with the residue of the day, muscles aching in familiar places, skin sensitive where punishment had recently passed. The house around me breathed in its usual way, wood expanding and contracting, distant movement, the subtle reminders that I was never truly alone. I stared into the dark and realized something with startling calm. If I stayed, nothing would change. Not slowly, not eventually, not after more obedience, more patience, more faith. Staying meant repetition without end. That realization did not terrify me. It relieved me. Fear had always relied on the promise that compliance would improve conditions. Once that promise dissolved, fear lost its purpose. I did not plan to leave that night. Not in the way stories plan escape, with maps and routes and rehearsed bravery. The decision came first. The details followed reluctantly. I thought of my children. Not in panic, but with clarity sharpened by exhaustion. I thought of what they would learn if I stayed, what obedience would teach them, what silence would carve into their understanding of the world. I realized then that endurance could become inheritance. and that thought I could not accept. Leaving did not feel like hope. It felt like refusal. I moved carefully, quietly, as I had learned to do my entire life. My body already knew how to make itself small, how to avoid attention, how to move without sound. These skills, once used to survive captivity, now became tools for departure. I gathered almost nothing. There was nothing that truly belonged to me. Objects had never been mine in any meaningful way. What I carried instead were decisions heavy, invisible, irreversible. The air outside felt different. Not free, but open. Each step away from the house carried weight. Not because I feared being caught, though that fear existed, but because I understood the finality of movement. Leaving meant crossing a boundary that could not be uncrossed. I did not know where I was going. I knew only where I was no longer willing to remain. The road stretched ahead in known uncertainty. Staying behind me held only certainty of suffering. Between the two, uncertainty felt lighter. I walked with my thoughts measured and quiet. Panic would waste energy. Emotion would draw attention. I moved the way I had learned to work, steadily, without excess. Time behaved strangely that night. Moments stretched. Distances felt unreal. Every sound sharpened. Every shadow suggested possibility. I learned quickly how loud the world could be when one was no longer protected by routine. Routine, even cruel routine, muffles danger. Without it, everything felt exposed. I did not think of myself as brave. Bravery implies confidence. I felt none. What I felt was necessity. The knowledge that something inside me had reached its limit and would not bend further. That obedience, once a strategy, had become a trap. There were moments when doubt pressed in hard, when the familiar pull of submission whispered that I should turn back, apologize, resume my place. Familiar suffering has a strange gravity, but each time that thought surfaced, another followed it, immediately. Turning back will not make this easier. It will only make it longer. I walked through that night, carrying exhaustion, fear, resolve, and something else, something newly solid, choice. For the first time in my life, my movement was not directed by command. My steps were not corrections. My path was not assigned. I was not free, but I was moving toward freedom, and that difference mattered. By the time light began to soften the edges of the dark, I understood that my life had shifted permanently. Even if I were captured, even if I were punished beyond what I had already known, something had already happened that could not be undone. I had chosen, and that choice, quiet, uncelebrated, dangerous, was mine. Freedom did not feel like relief when it first touched my life. It felt like exposure. There is a lie told about freedom that it arrives as lightness, as air rushing into lungs long deprived of breath, that it immediately replaces fear with peace, that chains fall away, and the body somehow forgets their weight. That was not my experience. When I left, I did not step into safety. I stepped into uncertainty so wide it had no edges. Every sound mattered now. Every decision carried consequence. There was no routine to hide inside, no familiar structure to soften danger. Freedom, I learned, removes shelter before it offers protection. In the days that followed my departure, my body remained trained for captivity. I still woke alert, still listened for commands, still measured my movements, as if someone were watching, even when no one was. I moved through spaces that did not claim me, yet did not welcome me either. Doors opened cautiously. Faces studied me without trust. Freedom did not mean belonging. It meant negotiation. I learned quickly that being free did not erase the past written into my skin. People saw my body and assigned meaning to it before I spoke. They saw labor before humanity, risk before worth. I understood then that freedom without recognition is fragile. Still, I persisted. I worked when work was offered. I remained careful with my words. Silence had kept me alive before. Now it kept me unnoticed. I watched how free people moved, how they assumed safety, how they spoke without calculating consequence. That ease did not belong to me. Not yet. What followed was not rest, but struggle rearranged. Hunger wore a different shape. Fear arrived from new directions. I had escaped ownership, but I had not escaped vulnerability. And then there was my child. Freedom, when it arrived incomplete, sharpened loss. One of my children had been taken and sold away, sold into a system I knew intimately, cruelly. I could not accept that escape meant abandonment. The thought of endurance becoming inheritance returned, heavier than before. This time, I refused it. I learned of laws then, strange, distant structures that claimed authority over lives they barely acknowledged. I learned that there were words on paper that declared rights, even for those like me. I learned that freedom could be argued. The idea felt impossible. A black woman, formerly enslaved, illiterate, standing against men who believed the law belonged to them. But impossibility had lost its power over me. I had already crossed one boundary that could not be uncrossed. Crossing another no longer felt unthinkable. So I went to court. The space itself felt hostile. Not overtly, but quietly, in the way walls watched, in the way voices shifted when I entered. I felt eyes on me, weighing not my claim, but my audacity. I stood there carrying no documents, no polished language, no confidence borrowed from education. I carried only certainty sharpened by loss. I spoke as I could. I spoke plainly, slowly, carefully. I spoke of my child, of ownership that had followed us, even into supposed freedom, of a system that separated families as casually as it sold furniture. I did not speak beautifully. I spoke truthfully. The process was long, heavy, exhausting. Each step demanded patience I did not always have, but patience had been trained into me over years of endurance. I used it now differently. This time, patience was not submission. It was insistence. When the decision came, it did not feel triumphant. It felt unreal. The law, that distant, impersonal structure, had tilted, just slightly, in my direction. My child was returned to me. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. Not because justice had been served fully, it had not, but because the impossible had cracked. I understood then that the world I lived in was not immovable, that laws, like chains, were constructed, that authority, like ownership, relied on belief as much as force. This realization did not soften my life. It hardened my purpose. Freedom was no longer just an escape from suffering. It became responsibility. Awareness demanded response. Knowledge demanded use. I could not return to quiet endurance. Not after learning that words could move structures. Not after seeing power hesitate. I did not yet know what shape my life would take. I did not yet imagine myself standing before crowds, speaking openly, challenging the foundations of the world that had shaped me. But I knew this. Silence was no longer my refuge. Freedom had arrived, not gently, not kindly, but irrevocably. And once tasted, even in fragments, it demanded more. There comes a time when a name can no longer carry the weight of what you have lived. Mine reached that point quietly. I had carried the name Isabella through ownership, through endurance, through loss and survival. It had followed me through fields and rooms, through punishment and prayer. It had been spoken by those who commanded me, and by those who barely noticed my presence. That name had held me together when I needed something to answer to, but it no longer fit. It belonged to a life defined by reaction, by response, by movement dictated from outside. And I had stepped beyond that life. The change did not happen suddenly. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration. It unfolded slowly, as most irreversible things do. A feeling that lingered, a discomfort that refused to fade. I realized that when people spoke my name, they spoke to the past version of me, to the woman who endured, to the woman who survived by silence. That woman was still part of me, but she was no longer the whole of me. I had learned that freedom demanded orientation. Without it, movement became wandering, and I felt something pressing forward inside me. Not ambition, not pride, but direction. I began to feel that my life was no longer simply mine to live, but mine to use. This understanding frightened me more than captivity ever had. Responsibility is heavier than chains when it arrives without instruction. I spoke to God again, not with the confusion of earlier years, not with anger, but with readiness. I asked what was required of me now that silence was no longer necessary, what I was meant to do with the voice I had guarded for so long. What direction suffering pointed toward when it finally loosened its grip. I did not hear a voice, but I felt a clarity settle that was unmistakable. I understood that I was not meant to disappear into quiet freedom, not meant to blend into safety, not meant to treat survival as an ending. I was meant to speak, not for performance, not for approval, but because I had seen what silence protects and what it enables. I left my old name behind because it belonged to a chapter that had closed. I chose a new one because names can be promises. Sojourner, one who travels, one who does not stay, one who moves with purpose rather than escape. Truth, not decoration, not argument, but commitment. I did not choose that name to sound powerful. I chose it because it frightened me, because it left no room for retreat, because it demanded alignment between what I believed and what I was willing to endure. Taking that name meant accepting that my life would no longer be quiet. It meant that safety would be inconsistent, that comfort would be temporary, that conflict would follow. But it also meant that my voice would no longer belong to fear. When I introduced myself with my new name, people reacted in different ways. Some smiled politely, not understanding. Some frowned, sensing disruption. Others laughed not cruelly, but dismissively. I did not correct them. I had learned that truth does not require permission. As I moved through towns and gatherings, I listened before I spoke. I watched how people gathered. Who was allowed to speak? Who was expected to listen? The patterns were familiar. Different faces. Same structures. I recognized the silence of others, like me immediately. The lowered eyes. The careful posture. The restraint learned over years. I began to speak into that silence, not loudly at first, not confidently. I spoke plainly. I told my story without embellishment, without apology. I described ownership as it was lived, not as it was justified. I spoke of labor, of violence, of faith shaped in darkness. Some listened, some turned away, but something shifted each time words moved from my body into the air. I felt alignment. The long separation between endurance and meaning began to close. My past no longer pulled me backward. It stood behind me, solid, undeniable, giving weight to every word I spoke. I was no longer surviving my history. I was using it. This did not make my life easier. Speaking created tension. Visibility attracted scrutiny. Truth unsettles structures that depend on quiet. But I had already learned that ease is not the measure of worth. I had spent too many years confusing silence with safety. Now, when fear returned, as it often did, it found me oriented, moving, committed. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me. I was defined by what I was willing to carry forward. My old name had kept me alive. My new name demanded that I live. The first time I stood to speak, my body remembered fear before my mind formed words. Not the sharp fear of punishment, but the deeper one, the older one, the fear of being seen. Visibility had always been dangerous. Being noticed invited judgment, correction, violence. For years, I had learned how to fold myself inward, how to take up as little space as possible. Now, I was doing the opposite. I was standing. Rooms felt different when I entered them with intention. The air shifted. Conversations paused. Eyes followed me, not with welcome, but with curiosity edged in doubt. They did not expect me to speak. They expected me to listen. I recognized that expectation immediately. It lived in posture, in silence, in the way authority arranges bodies before it arranges ideas. I waited until the noise settled. Waiting had been my training. I knew how to let a room quiet itself without force. When I spoke, it was not loud. It did not need to be. My voice carried the weight of years spent holding it back. I did not begin with arguments. I did not cite books or laws. Those tools belonged to people who had always been allowed to speak. I began instead with what I knew, my body, my labor, my life. I spoke of being owned as one speaks of weather, not dramatically, not emotionally, but with precision. I described work, punishment, separation, endurance. I did not ask for sympathy, I stated fact. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, drawn in by something they had not expected. Not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. I spoke slowly. I had learned that speed invites dismissal. Slowness forces attention. As I spoke, I felt my body settle. The tremor in my hands quieted. My breath found rhythm. Years of silence released themselves not as flood, but as current. I did not feel powerful. I felt aligned. Men interrupted. They always did. Not angrily, confidently. Used to their voices shaping outcomes. Used to correction being welcomed. I did not argue with them. I waited. Waiting unsettles those accustomed to control. When they finished, I continued exactly where I had left off. I spoke of womanhood as I had lived it, not as theory, not as ideal. I spoke of strength demanded but never praised, of labor expected but never honored, of bodies used to sustain worlds that refused to acknowledge them. Some laughed. Not cruelly, comfortably. Laughter is often a defense against discomfort. I did not respond to it. I spoke instead of endurance, not as virtue, but as evidence. Evidence of capability, of humanity, of worth that existed regardless of recognition. I spoke of God, not as permission for hierarchy, but as witness, as presence that did not belong exclusively to those with education or authority. I did not say what people expected a woman to say. I did not say what people expected a black woman to say. I said what was true. As my words settled into the room, I felt something unfamiliar move through the space. Hesitation. Power hesitates when it encounters something it cannot categorize. They had prepared for anger, for pleading, for performance. They had not prepared for certainty. When questions came, they came awkwardly. Some were genuine, others were thinly veiled attempts to reassert control. I answered simply. I did not over-explain. I did not defend my right to speak. I assumed it. That assumption did more than any argument could have. I began to be invited to other gatherings. Not because I was welcomed, known disruptions are rarely welcomed, but because I was effective, because rooms changed when I entered them, because people left unsettled. Unsettlement is the first sign of movement. Travel became my life. I walked roads that carried me through towns and cities, through spaces where comfort and cruelty lived side by side. I spoke wherever people gathered, churches, halls, open fields. Some doors opened, others closed. Closed doors taught me as much as open ones. I learned which truths were tolerated and which ones cut too close. I learned how quickly people who claimed to value justice retreated when justice demanded cost. Still, I continued, each time I spoke, I felt the distance between my past and my present shorten. My body no longer carried silence as burden. It carried history as foundation. There were moments of fear, moments when hostility sharpened, when voices rose, when threats were implied rather than spoken. I knew those signals well. They were old companions, but fear no longer organized me. Purpose did. I had learned that silence protects systems more reliably than violence ever could, and I had decided, fully, irrevocably, to withdraw my silence. I did not speak because I believed I would win every room. I spoke because I had already survived losing. Each time I stood and spoke, something shifted, not always in the room, but in me. My voice grew steadier. My presence grew heavier. I no longer introduced myself tentatively. I arrived as myself, not as exception, not as symbol, as proof. Proof that a body once owned could stand unowned, that a voice once suppressed could reorder space, that history does not only move forward through those who write laws, but through those who refuse erasure. I did not know then which words would be remembered, which moments would be written down, which sentences would outlive my body. That was never my concern. My concern was alignment between what I had lived and what I was willing to say. And in that alignment, I found something stronger than safety. I found inevitability. By the time I stood in that room, I had spoken many times before. I had faced doubt, mockery, dismissal, dressed as politeness. But this room was different. The air was thick with certainty, not mine, but theirs. Men sat comfortably in their beliefs. Women listened from the edges, trained by habit to make space rather than claim it. Words moved easily among those accustomed to being heard. They spoke of women, of weakness, of delicacy, of protection. They spoke as if womanhood were fragile by nature, as if it required constant guidance, constant rescue. They spoke as if strength and womanhood could not exist in the same body. I listened. Listening had taught me more than speaking ever could. They spoke of intellect, of rights, of capacity, and all the while they spoke around me, not to me, as if my presence were an inconvenience rather than contradiction. Something settled in my chest then, not anger, recognition. I stood. The movement alone changed the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not announce myself. I simply occupied space that had not been offered. I spoke of my body, not abstractly, not symbolically. I spoke of arms that had worked fields from sunrise to darkness, of strength that had lifted, carried, endured without pause. I spoke of pain that had not been protected from me, of hardship that had not been softened by courtesy. No one had ever offered me help into carriages. No one had ever cleared muddy paths for my feet. No one had ever shielded me from the weight of the world. And yet, I was a woman. I spoke of bearing children, of love intertwined with fear, of loss that carved itself into the body and stayed there, of motherhood lived under threat of separation, sale, erasure. I did not romanticize it. I told it as it was. And then I asked the question, not loudly, not angrily, simply, and was I not a woman? The room did not answer immediately. Silence arrived, not the enforced silence I had known in captivity, but the unsettled kind, the kind that appears when certainty cracks and has not yet decided how to repair itself. I did not wait for permission to continue. I spoke of intelligence, denied not by nature, but by design, of opportunity withheld, then cited as absence of capacity. I spoke of God not as property of men, not as justification for hierarchy, but as creator who did not distribute humanity unevenly. If the first woman was made strong enough to turn the world upside down, I asked, then why should women now be considered incapable of standing upright within it? I did not demand agreement. I demanded reckoning. Some faces hardened, some softened, some turned away. But something irreversible happened. The room could no longer pretend I did not exist. That was the power of the question. It did not seek approval. It forced acknowledgement. I did not leave that room celebrated. I left it altered. And alteration spreads. Years passed. My body changed. Strength shifted. Pain lingered longer. Movements slowed. But my voice did not soften. If anything, it sharpened. I had learned that time does not automatically grant wisdom. It grants perspective to those willing to look. I had lived long enough to recognize patterns, to see progress claimed prematurely, to hear promises repeated without intention. I did not become gentle with age. I became precise. I continued to travel, to speak, to stand where discomfort gathered. I spoke against slavery even when it had learned new disguises. I spoke for women when their voices were still considered interruptions. I was no longer surprised by resistance. I expected it. Expectation frees energy. I no longer wasted effort on convincing those committed to misunderstanding me. I spoke instead for those listening quietly, those absorbing without immediate response, those who would carry fragments of my words into places I would never see. I understood then that impact does not require applause. It requires persistence. There were days when fatigue pressed heavily, when my body reminded me of everything it had endured. On those days, I returned inward to the quiet place where faith had first formed, where purpose had clarified. I had not chosen this life because it was safe. I had chosen it because it was aligned, and alignment sustains longer than comfort ever could. When I look back now, I do not see a straight path. I see movement, from silence to speech, from endurance to intention, from survival to direction. I was born owned. I lived constrained. I chose movement. I did not become free all at once. Freedom arrived in fragments, decisions, refusals, questions asked aloud. Each fragment demanded something in return. Courage was never given to me. It was constructed, slowly, painfully, deliberately. I did not set out to become a symbol. Symbols are static, and I was always moving. I became instead something less contained, a passage, a reminder that history is not shaped only by those who hold power, but by those who withdraw their silence from it. I walked, I spoke, I remained. And if my words still travel, if my voice still unsettles, if my life still interrupts certainty, then let it be known, I was never extraordinary. I was awake. As my journey slowly comes to rest, I leave you not with answers, but with a quiet invitation. History is not shaped only by those who ruled, but by those who refused to disappear. Tonight, as you carry this story with you, remember that every voice, once silenced, still echoes somewhere beyond time. Where are you listening from right now? And which stories would you like to walk through together next? Rest gently. The road continues.